You know, they say that behind every great fortune lies a great crime. But sometimes it's not a crime. Sometimes it's just a crack. A tiny, almost invisible fissure in a facade so polished, so dazzling, it blinds everyone who looks. And then one day, that crack splinters and the whole damn thing comes crashing down. Serafina Sterling lived in such a gilded cage, though she wouldn't have called it that. Not at first. To the outside world, Serafina had it all. And who could argue? Her life was a meticulously crafted masterpiece of a billionaire lifestyle. The Sterling estate in Starhaven, Callista, a sprawling titan of architecture named Ethelgard, wasn't just a house, it was a declaration. Ivory stone gleaming under an ever-benevolent sun, gardens that whispered forgotten Elizabethan sonnets, and rooms so vast they seemed to swallow sound, light, and sometimes even will. Her husband, Alistair Sterling, God Alistair. A name that commanded boardrooms and made markets tremble. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of ambition and devastating charm, with a Midas touch that turned everything, including their union, into perceived gold. Their wedding on the Cerulean coast was the stuff of legends, splashed across global tabloids, hailed as the definitive societal event of the decade. Young, beautiful Serafina, the soft-spoken heiress to a venerable art curation dynasty, and Alistair, the self-made tycoon with eyes like glacial ice. A perfect marriage illusion, wasn't it? Or was it? From that sun-drenched ceremony onwards, Serafina learned a vital, unspoken rule of the ultra-rich. Masks weren't just accessories, they were essential. Survival gear. For years, Ethelgard served as the glittering epicenter of high society, a stage for endless galas where champagne flowed like water and laughter, just a little too bright, echoed off Renaissance tapestries and hypermodernist sculptures. The grand foyer, with its marble floors imported from a forgotten quarry near Coralia, sparkled under a colossal crystal chandelier Alistair had acquired his term from a crumbling Venetian palazzo. Serafina remembered choosing it, a rare moment Alistair had actually solicited her opinion. Or had he just been testing her taste? The memory was hazy. So many memories were. Long, silent hallways, lined with antique suits of armor that felt more alive than some of the guests, seemed to hum with the unspoken secrets of an opulent yet profoundly hollow existence. Sometimes, late at night, when the last of the sycophants had departed and the house fell into its cathedral-like hush, Serafina would wander those corridors. She often felt like a ghost in her own home, a beautifully dressed spectator. Every detail, from the thread count of the sheets to the curated guest lists, was orchestrated by Alistair's formidable team. His design, his control. It was exhausting. Still, she clung to the belief that there was genuine affection, or at least the potential for it. There had to be, right? They shared whispered jokes during those interminable charity dinners prepared by chefs whose names were spoken in hushed, reverent tones. And sometimes, just sometimes, they'd escape, sneaking off to a raucous, neon-lit diner in downtown Zenith City for greasy burgers and a slice of what Alistair called authentic peasant life. Those were the moments she treasured, the moments she replayed in her mind, searching for proof. Proof of what, exactly? That she wasn't just another acquisition? Alistair had his flaws, of course, monumental ones. But Serafina, raised in a family where appearances were everything and emotions were inconvenient, had been taught to accept them. Tolerance, her mother had called it, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. Her own parents had an arrangement, a glittering, frigid contract of a relationship that kept them bound together by shared assets and silent resentments. Serafina had always yearned for something more. Something real, not this elaborate, beautiful lie. She craved genuine connection, the kind you read about in dog-eared novels. Nights spent tangled in sheets, not for show, but for the sheer joy of closeness, talking about nothing and everything. Spontaneous weekend trips that didn't involve offshore accounts or hostile takeovers. And eventually, a family, a real family, bound by love, not by legacy. Then came the news, a fragile, fluttering hope. She was pregnant. Suddenly, everything felt different. This, she believed with a fierce, desperate certainty, was it. The missing piece. The golden thread that would finally weave their lives into a tapestry of genuine love. Not just a display of shattered dreams artfully arranged. It felt like a promise, a sunrise after a long, dark night. Surely, this baby would change Alistair. The subtle, chilling rifts between them, the unspoken tensions that hung in the air like expensive, stale perfume, they would vanish, wouldn't they? The moment Alistair realized he was going to be a father, truly a father, he'd see, he'd understand. The man who built empires would finally build a home. With her. Oh, how naive that pregnancy hope now seemed. How heartbreakingly vulnerable she had allowed herself to be. Because in the world of carefully constructed illusions, the truth, when it finally claws its way out, is never gentle. It's a wrecking ball. And the hidden secret Alistair harbored, the one lurking just beneath the polished veneer of their perfect life, was about to be unleashed. The air in Athelgard was growing colder, the shadows in those long hallways deepening, whispering of an impending storm. Serafina, adrift in her sea of hopeful anticipation, felt a prickle of unease, a discordant note in the symphony of her carefully managed bliss. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. But what? And how could a single, unexpected tremor bring an entire world, built on a bedrock of wealth and power, to the brink of utter devastation? She was about to find out. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same. That cold, coiling dread Serafina had felt, it didn't just whisper, it began to scream. And the universe, with its twisted sense of irony, chose the most mundane of mornings to unleash the devastation. It wasn't a dramatic, rain-lashed night. No, the sun was shining, birds were probably chirping some infuriatingly cheerful tune outside the vast mullioned windows of Athelgard. Another Tuesday. Or was it Wednesday? The days had a way of blurring into a seamless, luxurious haze. Her personal assistant, a prim and efficient woman named Miss Albright, Alistair's choice, of course, had brought in the morning's correspondence on a silver tray, just as she always did. Bills, invitations to yet another soulless gala, glossy brochures for investments. Serafina pretended to understand. And then there it was. A single piece of paper. That's all it took for a billionaire's meticulously constructed empire of deceit to shatter before his pregnant wife's eyes. The envelope was crisp, expensive vellum, addressed to Mr. Alistair Sterling. Nothing unusual there. But the return address, a private clinic in Port City. Not one of Alistair's known discreet healthcare providers, all conveniently located in Zenith City or within the exclusive medical enclaves of Starhaven. Port City? Why Port City? A tiny alarm bell, initially dismissed as pregnancy-induced paranoia, began to clang with deafening insistence. Her hands, usually so steady when appraising a priceless artifact or navigating a treacherous social event, trembled as she slid it open with a mother-of-pearl letter opener. Inside, a single sheet, an invoice, for prenatal checkups, and a battery of lab tests. Her heart stumbled. This had to be a mistake, some ghastly administrative error. But the tests, they weren't in her name. The world didn't just tilt, it cartwheeled. Nausea, far more potent than any morning sickness she'd endured, clawed at her throat. There, in cold impersonal type, patient name Zara Dubois, and a due date. A due date chillingly close to her own. The father's name, printed with stark, undeniable clarity on the official records. Alistair Sterling. Alistair. Her Alistair? Could it be some other Alistair Sterling? A cruel cosmic joke? But the address listed for him, it was the penthouse he kept in Port City, the one he used for those urgent, can't-be-missed business trips. The ones that always left him smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers. The infidelity discovery wasn't a slow burn, it was an explosion, a detonation that ripped through the very foundations of her existence. Shattering betrayal. Those weren't just words anymore, they were shards of glass in her soul. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred. Zara Dubois. The name meant nothing, and everything. She could hear Miss Albright's polite cough from the doorway. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Sterling?" Serafina forced a smile, a grotesque rictus that felt like it might crack her face. "Perfectly fine, Miss Albright, just a billing query. I'll handle it." She tucked the damning paper away, her fingers icy. "Please, I need to make a call. Alone." The moment the door clicked shut, she was pacing the length of her gilded cage, the plush Aubusson carpet muffling her frantic steps. Phone in hand, her first instinct to call him, to scream, to demand. But what was the point? The evidence was irrefutable. The man she loved, the father of her unborn child, was also the father of another unborn child, with another woman. The sheer brazen duplicity of it was staggering. How many lies had he told? How many secrets were still buried beneath the surface of their perfect life? She sank onto a chaise lounge, one hand protectively cradling her belly, the other clutching the poisonous truth. For the sake of her baby, their baby, she had to be calm. Or try to be. How do you stay calm when your world has just been nuked? She remembered all those late nights he'd come home, smelling of expensive scotch and an exhaustion that wasn't just from business. The sudden weekend trips for emergency negotiations. God, she'd believed him. Willfully, stupidly believed him. Because that was her role, wasn't it? The supportive, trusting wife. The fool. Now every shared memory felt tainted, every loving gesture a calculated lie. Her heart, that stubborn, hopeful muscle, felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Each beat an agonizing throb. Finally, with a resolve she didn't know she possessed, she dialed his private number. The line crackled. He was probably on his jet, flitting between continents, between lives. When he finally answered, his voice was warm, familiar, laced with that easy charm that had once made her knees weak. "Serafina, darling, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Just hearing his voice, so normal, so oblivious, nearly broke her. "Alistair," she managed, her voice a thin, quavering thread despite her best efforts. "I need you to come home, now." A pause. Then, that infuriatingly patient tone he used when she was being emotional. "Sweetheart, I'm in the middle of closing the Triton deal. Billions at stake. Can it possibly wait?" "No," she said, and the steel in her voice surprised even herself. "No, Alistair, it absolutely cannot wait. It's urgent." Even miles away, through the static and the roar of engines, he must have sensed the shift, the ice in her tone. Because for once, he didn't argue. He just said, "I'll be there as soon as I can." As soon as he could. How many hours would that be? Hours for the truth to fester, for the rage to build, for the heartbreak to solidify into something cold and hard. By the time his helicopter whirred onto the private helipad at Ethelgard, Serafina had reread that damning invoice so many times the ink seemed to bleed into her vision. She'd memorized every cruel detail. She was waiting for him in their cavernous bedroom, a room that now felt like a mausoleum. The fireplace crackled merrily, oblivious to the Arctic chill that had settled in her soul. He burst through the ornate double doors, his handsome face etched with a carefully constructed mask of concern. "Serafina? What's wrong? Are you all right? Is it the baby?" His eyes, those laser-sharp blue eyes, scanned her, probably looking for signs of physical distress. He was always so good at managing the visible. She just stared at him, her own eyes hollow, devoid of the adoration he was so used to seeing. Without a word, she held out the single sheet of paper. The husband's confession was about to be extracted, one way or another. The color drained from Alistair Sterling's face with shocking speed. The moment his gaze fell upon his name, linked with Zara Dubois, linked with a due date that mirrored her own, his lips parted. But no sound emerged. For one fleeting second, Serafina saw something she'd never witnessed before. Alistair Sterling, titan of industry, master of the universe, utterly, completely off guard. He looked like a child caught red-handed, not with his hand in the cookie jar but with a dagger in his spouse's back. It was almost pitiful. Almost. "Serafina," he began, his voice raw, stripped of its usual confident timbre. It's not what you think." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, isn't it? You don't even know what I think, Alistair. So why don't you enlighten me? Who the hell is Zara Dubois, and why is she having your baby?" Her voice rose with each word, the carefully constructed calm shattering into a million razor-sharp pieces. He looked stricken, his gaze darting around the opulent room, to the roaring fireplace, the priceless art on the walls, the door, anywhere but directly at her. Anywhere but at the devastation he had wrought. "It was a mistake," he finally mumbled, still clutching the paper as if it might spontaneously combust. His hand was actually shaking. Imagine that. Alistair Sterling, shaking. We had an affair. But it ended, Serafina, I swear it. Months ago. I never thought. She told me she was careful. I didn't know she was pregnant until recently. I didn't know how to tell you." A mistake? An affair that ended? Her entire body trembled, not with fear, but with a rage so potent it threatened to consume her. "You're telling me," she whispered, her voice dangerously low, "that you have another baby on the way, when you know I'm 5 months pregnant with our child? Our child, Alistair." Tears, hot and furious, sprang to her eyes, but she blinked them back with a will of iron. No. She would not break. Not in front of him. She had to maintain some shred of dignity, if only for the tiny, innocent life growing inside her, a life now irrevocably tainted by his betrayal. Each second stretched into an eternity of condensed heartbreak. He tried to approach her then, the audacity of the man, tried to put his hands on her shoulders, to offer some pathetic empty gesture of comfort. "Serafina, I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I was stupid. It meant nothing. Zara, I was lonely." "Lonely?" She pushed him away, a surprising strength surging through her. "Lonely?" She seethed, the word dripping with contempt. "You have me, your wife, your pregnant wife. And if you were so damn lonely, Alistair, you could have talked to me. You could have tried. Instead, you sneaked around behind my back like a common cheat. You destroyed everything. Everything we built. Everything I believed in." In that moment, the sheer, breathtaking glamour of their life, the life that had once defined her, meant less than nothing. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the lavish dinners, the private jets. All of it was hollow, meaningless, a grotesque parody in the face of such a monumental, soul-crushing betrayal. Serafina felt the very foundations of her world crack, irreparably. This wasn't just an infidelity discovery. This was annihilation. Late that night, long after Alistair's pleas and apologies had faded into the heavy silence outside her locked bedroom door. A guest room, ironically, as she now felt more like an unwelcome guest in her own life than ever before. Serafina made a decision. She couldn't stay. She couldn't raise her child, in an environment so thick with lies it choked the very air she breathed. The storm inside her raged, a maelstrom of grief and fury. Between racking sobs that shook her entire frame, she pulled out a leather-bound journal, a beautiful, cream-paged book she'd bought on their honeymoon in Isola Marina, intending it for joyful recollections, for charting the course of their beautiful life together. Now its pristine pages would become the silent confidant to her deepest anguish, her most resolute vow. Why did he do it? Was it her fault? What about their baby? Could she ever trust him again? Each question was a fresh stab to her already bleeding heart. Sleep was an impossibility. As dawn painted the manicured lawns of Ethelgard in hues of gray and mournful rose, an idea, a plan, began to crystallize amidst the wreckage of her pain. A courageous escape. She had to get away, far away. Somewhere the name Sterling didn't echo in every hushed conversation, wasn't etched into every gilded cornice. She needed air, distance, a chance to salvage what was left of her sanity, to protect the innocent life within her. Pregnant and alone. The thought was terrifying, and yet, strangely, liberating. Later that morning, when Alistair, frantic and red-eyed, finally left for a critical board meeting he couldn't possibly cancel. Oh, the irony, his precious business still taking precedence. Serafina knew it was her chance. Her only chance. With hands that still trembled, but with a core of newfound steel, she penned the farewell letter. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was a testament to her shattered heart, a declaration of her independence. "Alistair," she wrote, the ink flowing like blood from a mortal wound. "You have inflicted a wound so deep that every breath I take feels laced with the poison of your betrayal. Perhaps I was naive to trust so completely, to believe in the fairy tale you so expertly crafted. I loved you. I believed in us. Now I see only the cruelty, the hollowness beneath the glitter. You've broken us, Alistair, in ways that apologies, or even your vast fortune, can never mend. I am leaving. I don't know when, or if I'll ever return. Our child, my child, deserves better than the toxic environment you've created. Maybe in time, I'll find it in me to forgive. But as of now, the very sight of you is a torment. Don't look for me. You won't find me. By the time you read this, I'll be gone." She signed her name, Serafina. Not Mrs. Sterling, just Serafina. A woman reborn in the crucible of his deceit. She refused to let tears stain the crisp parchment. Once done, she sealed the note in a plain, unmarked envelope and left it on his massive, empty nightstand. Then, with a chilling efficiency that would have impressed even Alistair, she called a discreet car service, one he had no stake in, no knowledge of. She arranged to leave quietly from a little-used side entrance. She took only the essentials. Her passport, a bundle of emergency cash she'd squirreled away, a habit from her mother, who always said a woman should have her own escape fund, just in case. A few changes of simple, unremarkable clothes, and her prenatal vitamins. The diamonds, the designer gowns, the symbols of her gilded cage, she left them all behind. They felt like shackles now. With trembling steps, she walked out of Ethelgard, the mansion that had symbolized both her dream and her prison. The staff, blessed their discreet hearts, sensed her distress and kept their distance, their worried eyes following her silent departure. As the anonymous black SUV pulled away, Serafina allowed herself one last look. The life she was leaving behind wasn't the one she thought she'd had. It was a mirage, a beautiful, elaborate lie, now shattered by the devastating force of his deception. She had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only an echo and a letter. A letter that would soon detonate in Alistair Sterling's perfectly ordered world. The silence of the grand mansion, when he finally returned hours later, would be a deafening testament to his catastrophic mistake. He who believed he had everything would realize in one heart-stopping moment that he now had absolutely nothing of value. But where had Serafina gone? And how could a man who commanded empires, who moved markets with a whisper, even begin to find one pregnant woman his wife, so fiercely determined to disappear forever from his life? The hunt, he would soon learn, was on, and the stakes, higher than any deal he'd ever brokered. The hunt was indeed on. And Alistair Sterling, a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, a titan whose pronouncements could make or break fortunes, found himself utterly, terrifyingly impotent. The letter, Serafina's parting shot, lay on his vast empty bed like a shard of ice in his gut. Don't look for me, you won't find me. A challenge, a curse. He'd mobilized everything. His global security apparatus, an army of discreet and astronomically expensive fixers, even leaning on contacts in governmental agencies that officially didn't exist. He poured through credit card transactions. Serafina had been smarter than that, using only the emergency cash her mother, Leonora, had insisted she always keep. Flight records were a blank. Bank withdrawals non-existent after that initial sum. Every lead turned into a cold, dead end. Days bled into weeks. The silence in Ethelgard was no longer just quiet. It was accusatory, a living entity that mocked his power. He'd pace the endless corridors, her scent, a faint whisper of jasmine and defiance, still clinging to the air in her abandoned rooms. He'd wake in the dead of night, drenched in a cold sweat, her name a raw wound on his lips. Guilt, an emotion he'd long considered a luxury for lesser men, now gnawed at him relentlessly. This was more than a failed merger or a stock plunge. This was the decimation of something he hadn't even realized he valued until it was gone. His child, their child, lost to him. And Serafina, was she safe? Was she even alive? The thought was a fresh stab of agony. What if, in her despair, she? No, he couldn't go there. But the not knowing was a torture chamber of its own. She traded diamonds for anonymity, a mansion for a windswept cottage. But could Serafina truly escape the ghosts of her past, or her billionaire husband's relentless reach? Miles away, in the salty, fog-laced obscurity of Port Celeste, a tiny forgotten fishing village, clinging precariously to the rugged coastline, about as far from the polished grandeur of Starhaven, Callista, as one could get while remaining on the same continent, Serafina Sterling was methodically erasing herself. Or rather, erasing the her Alistair had known, the woman she herself had almost forgotten existed beneath the layers of societal expectation and marital performance. This new life in hiding was stark, brutal even. The charmingly dilapidated cottage she rented under an assumed name, Anna Vance, from a kindly, inquisitive elderly widow named Mrs. Alara Vance, was a universe away from Ethelgard. Drafty windows rattled with every gust of wind from the tempestuous ocean. The plumbing groaned like a dying beast, and the nearest purveyor of haute couture was probably 3 states over. And yet there was a raw, untamed beauty to it all. Anonymity felt like a balm on her wounded soul, the constant drizzle and overcast skies a perfect mirror to her mood. For the first time in years, Serafina felt untethered. Frightened. Yes, overwhelmingly so at times, but also strangely, fiercely alive. Her resilience surprised even herself. This was the little-known fact about Serafina, the side Alistair, in his arrogant certainty, had never bothered to discover. Beneath the silk and diamonds was a core of unyielding steel. A mother's protection, raw and primal, fueled her every move. She learned to budget, to haggle at the local fish market, to fix a leaky faucet with nothing but sheer determination and a prayer. She walked for miles along the deserted, pebble-strewn beaches, the wind whipping her hair, the rhythmic crash of the waves a counterpoint to the turmoil in her heart. The solitude was both a comfort and a torment. Some days, the silence of her tiny cottage was a peaceful haven. On others, it was a breeding ground for 1,000 anxieties. What if he found her? What if something happened to the baby? Could she really do this, pregnant and alone? She'd spend hours journaling, pouring her heartbreak, her rage, her confusion onto the pages of that Asola Marina notebook. Each kick from her unborn child was a reminder of what she was fighting for. Her strength grew with each passing day, a quiet, unshowy fortitude. Back in the glittering snake pit of Alistair's world, however, things were far from quiet. Zara Dubois, sensing a power vacuum and an opportunity, was not about to fade gracefully into the background. Oh no. Zara was a woman of ambition, a creature of sharp angles and even sharper instincts. With Serafina vanished without a trace, Zara began to escalate her mistress's demands. She wanted more than just a penthouse in Port City and a generous allowance. She wanted recognition. She wanted Alistair's name for her child, a secure position in his life, perhaps even the coveted role of the new Mrs. Sterling. Wouldn't that be a delicious scandal for the tabloids? She started calling Alistair incessantly, her voice a venomous cocktail of cloying sweetness and unveiled threats. She'd show up unannounced at the imposing Zenith City headquarters of Sterling Global, causing a delicious flurry of gossip among the already buzzing staff. To Alistair, already drowning in his fruitless search and mounting guilt, Zara's presence was a constant, unwelcome reminder of his catastrophic betrayal, a human embodiment of his folly. He tried to placate her with money. More money, always more money, hoping to keep her satisfied, to keep her quiet. He set up a colossal trust fund for her unborn child, paid for every conceivable prenatal appointment at the most exclusive clinics. But Zara wasn't content with just financial security. She craved his emotional involvement, his public acknowledgement. She wanted him to attend LeMay's classes, for God's sake, to rub her feet, to whisper reassurances that she wasn't just a dirty secret. Each demand, each manipulative tear, was like another nail in the coffin of his self-respect. He felt choked by the new dynamic, effectively splitting his life. The obsessive, desperate search for Serafina on one side, and this forced, increasingly loathsome paternal obligation to Zara on the other. Some nights he'd sleep in his office or a sterile hotel suite, just to avoid her cloying presence, her insatiable need. The pressure was immense. And what about the little secret he was keeping from Zara? The fact that Serafina was also pregnant? How long before that particular bomb detonated? The first real tangible lead in Serafina's disappearance came not from Alistair's army of high-priced investigators, but from a quiet, almost invisible financial tremor, a withdrawal. $50,000 in cash, drawn from a personal trust Serafina had access to, one Alistair had almost forgotten existed. The transaction had occurred at a small independent bank in Cascadia City. Not conclusive proof of her whereabouts, not by a long shot, but it was something. A flicker of hope in the suffocating darkness. Alistair was on his private jet within the hour, thundering towards the Pacific Northwest, a renewed, almost feral determination in his eyes. But even in Cascadia City, a sprawling metropolis known for its tech giants and its relentless reign, he was met with a wall of closed doors and infuriating confidentiality regulations. The bank, citing privacy laws, refused to release video footage without a court order. A process that would take precious days, maybe weeks. His attempts to bribe, to strong-arm, to leverage his considerable influence, all backfired spectacularly. All he had was a timeline, a possible lead to a string of nondescript motels on the city's outskirts. By the time his team managed to cut through the red tape and access the grainy surveillance footage, Serafina, or Anna Vance, was long gone. She'd been a ghost, a whisper, presumably now tucked away in her coastal solitude in Port Celeste, completely unaware that Alistair had been, for a few tantalizing hours, so terrifyingly close. As he drove aimlessly through the rain-slicked streets of Cascadia City that night, the weight of his regret, his utter powerlessness, pressed down on him like a physical blow. For years he'd prided himself on being a man who could fix anything, acquire anything, control anything. Money, power, influence. These were the tools of his trade. And now, None of them could retrieve the one person, the one thing he desperately, achingly needed. How do you find someone who truly doesn't want to be found, especially when that someone is carrying a piece of your own soul? The months crawled by. Serafina entered her 7th month of pregnancy. Daily tasks, once effortless, now felt like monumental undertakings, but she persisted. Her quiet resilience, a testament to her fierce maternal instinct. She devoured library books on childbirth and natural parenting, each chapter fueling both her anxiety and her determination. She meticulously shopped for baby clothes at local thrift stores and quaint consignment shops, paying in cash, always in cash, careful to avoid leaving any digital breadcrumbs that might lead Alistair to her door. Sometimes the loneliness was a physical ache, a gnawing emptiness that nearly drove her to call her mother, Leonora, or her closest friend, Vivienne. She imagined their frantic worry, the questions, the recriminations. And then there was Alistair. Despite the white-hot rage that still simmered beneath the surface, there were moments, fleeting, treacherous moments, when she missed him. Missed the comforting weight of his arm around her, the sound of his laughter, however infrequent it had become, the illusion of an us she had once so desperately believed in. But each time her heart threatened to soften, the memory of his shattering betrayal, the cold, hard fact of Zara Dubois and another child, would rise up, a bulwark against any creeping sentimentality. She couldn't afford to forget. Not now. Not ever. One late afternoon, returning from a prenatal checkup with the kindly if slightly bewildered local physician, Dr. Silas Abernathy, she felt a sudden terrifying wave of dizziness. The world swam. She collapsed momentarily on the worn wooden steps of her cottage, her vision tunneling. Concerned neighbors, the ever-watchful Mrs. Vance among them, rushed to her aid, their worried faces a blur. An ambulance was called. At the small, slightly antiquated Port Celeste Community Hospital, she was diagnosed with severe dehydration and dangerously elevated blood pressure. Preeclampsia. The word hung in the sterile air, a death knell. It was a jolting, terrifying reminder that she was carrying precious cargo, that her stress, her isolation, her grief were not just her own burdens to bear, they were endangering her baby. Gripped by a primal fear, she realized, with a clarity that cut through her stubborn pride, that she couldn't do this entirely alone. She confided in Mrs. Vance, her stoic, pragmatic landlady, who, to Serafina's surprise, revealed her own quiet history of heartbreak and loss. A fragile bond formed between them, woven from shared tears and unspoken understanding. In those tender moments, surrounded by the scent of chamomile tea and old books in Mrs. Vance's cozy kitchen, Serafina found unexpected pockets of hope. Not everyone in the world was out to betray her. Some, it turned out, were simply there to lend a helping hand. Back in Starhaven, Alistair, driven to the edge of despair by his continued failure to find Serafina and the escalating melodrama with Zara, finally made a decision he'd been resisting. He would hire the best, someone outside his usual circle of yes-men and corporate sycophants. He needed a ghost hunter. He needed Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a legend in certain, very discreet circles. A former intelligence operative, now a private investigator of unparalleled skill and an unshakable, if somewhat unconventional code of ethics. He was expensive, he was elusive, and he was notoriously selective about his clientele. At first, Thorne, a man who valued his integrity above all else, was wary of working for the famously controversial, morally ambiguous billionaire. But the sheer desperation in Alistair Sterling's eyes, the raw, unfaked pain when he spoke of his missing pregnant wife, and, admittedly, the staggering sum offered, eventually persuaded him. Perhaps, Thorne mused, there was a chance here for genuine closure, for finding a resolution that might actually benefit the missing woman, not just her powerful, tormented husband. He accepted the case. The hunt had just gained a new, far more formidable predator. For weeks, Marcus Thorne moved like a phantom through the labyrinth of Serafina's former life, and then into the shadows of her escape. He scoured flight records, car rentals, encrypted communications, potential safe houses. He interviewed Serafina's few close friends, like Vivienne, who offered nothing but cryptic, fiercely loyal statements. Serafina is safe, and that's all you or anyone else needs to know. Despite the wall of silence, despite Serafina's cunning in using untraceable funds and burner phones, Thorne began to detect a faint trail, a whisper in the digital ether. She had prepared for this, he realized with a grudging admiration. She was far more resourceful than anyone, especially her husband, had ever given her credit for. The breakthrough, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A meticulously reconstructed timeline of her movements from Star Haven, a flicker of a face on grainy hotel surveillance footage in Cascadia City, a half-forgotten ferry manifest. It all pointed north, to the remote fog-shrouded coastline. To Port Celeste. Thorne traveled quietly, blending into the background like a chameleon. He checked local lodging options, his eyes scanning for any sign of a pregnant woman fitting Serafina's elegant, now undoubtedly fragile description. Days of fruitless searching turned into a week. He was about to give up, to report back to Alistair that the trail had gone cold, when he stumbled upon an older, chatty shopkeeper who recalled a sweet, sad-eyed young woman, clearly from out of town, and very much with child, who occasionally bought artisanal bread and local honey. Staying in a small cottage by the sea, the one owned by old Mrs. Vance. With subtle, expertly worded inquiries, Thorne confirmed the woman's assumed name, Anna. The final, undeniable stroke of luck, or perhaps inevitability, came when he saw her, in person. Stepping out of a small, independent bookstore, a second-hand copy of Meditations clutched in her hand. He recognized her instantly from the photographs Alistair had provided. Those luminous, intelligent eyes, now shadowed by an unbearable weight of heartbreak and fear. She wore a loose-fitting faded blue coat, her belly round and prominent beneath it, an unmistakable testament to the life she carried. She looked thinner, more fragile than in the glossy society pages. But there was a new strength in the set of her jaw, a quiet defiance in her gaze. Marcus Thorne observed her from a distance, his expression unreadable. He made no move to approach. Not yet. He noted the direction she walked, the quiet dignity of her movements, and confirmed her address at the windswept cottage overlooking the turbulent gray sea. He now faced a profound dilemma. His contractual obligation was to inform Alistair Sterling immediately. But his own principles, that stubborn, inconvenient moral compass that had so often complicated his life, urged a different course. Should he betray this woman's desperate bid for peace, or should he offer her something else? An option? He knocked on her cottage door later that evening as a wild coastal storm began to brew, the wind howling like a banshee. Serafina answered, her eyes widening in immediate instinctive fear at the sight of the tall, somber stranger silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. Yes? He removed his hat, revealing a gaze that was surprisingly sympathetic. Mrs. Sterling? Or perhaps you prefer Anna Vance? He said, his voice quiet, devoid of menace. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm a private investigator. I was hired by your husband. She tried to slam the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But Thorne, with a gentleness that belied his formidable presence, placed a hand on the weathered wood, stopping it. He doesn't know I'm here yet, Mrs. Sterling, he said softly, his eyes holding hers. He's desperate to find you, to know you're safe. But I wanted to speak with you first, to understand, to respect your wishes if possible. May I come in? Just to talk. I promise you, no tricks, no force. Serafina hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to deny. But there was something in Marcus Thorne's earnest tone, in the unexpected kindness in his weary eyes, that made her pause. Something that felt different. Not like Alistair, not like the world she had fled. Could this man, this hunter sent by her husband, actually be an unexpected ally? Or was this just another, more sophisticated form of deception? The wind howled louder, rattling the very bones of the little cottage, and Serafina knew, with a chilling certainty, that her fragile peace was about to be shattered once more. He found her. The ghost Alistair had been chasing was real, vulnerable, and fiercely protective. But Marcus Thorne's next move, whatever it might be, would stun everyone. Would he drag her back to a life she'd fled, a life of gilded misery? Or would he, against all odds, become an unlikely guardian of her precious, hard-won secret? And what, in God's name, would Serafina choose when faced with this impossible, terrifying moral quandary, with the storm raging both outside and within her fugitive heart? The wind didn't just howl around Serafina's tiny cottage in Port Celeste. It clawed, a furious, tormented beast, mirroring the tempest in her own heart. Marcus Thorne stood on her doorstep, a somber silhouette against the bruised and angry sky, his presence an undeniable omen. Drag her back? Become a guardian? What insane choices were these? Could she trust this man, this shadow sent by Alistair? Did she even have the strength left to choose? He saw it in her eyes, didn't he? The flicker of defiance warring with abject terror. "Please," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible above the screaming wind. "Just don't." Not a plea for him to leave, but a plea for understanding, for a sliver of mercy in a world that had shown her so little. And Thorne, a man who'd navigated the darkest alleys of human deceit, saw not a billionaire's runaway wife, but a terrified mother-to-be, cornered and desperate. He'd given her his word, for now. He wouldn't call Alistair. Not yet. He'd report that she was alive, perhaps even coping. But he'd also made it clear in his quiet, unwavering way that Alistair Sterling was a relentless force. And Serafina knew, deep in her bones, that this fragile reprieve was just that. Fragile, temporary. The ghosts of her past were patient. They would wait. How long did she really have? Days? Weeks? Before Alistair's relentless reach found her again? Weeks turned into a grim, anxious month. Serafina, now nearly 8 months into her harrowing solitary pregnancy, clung to her fragile peace in Port Celeste. Mrs. Alara Vance, her landlady with eyes that had seen too much of life's storms, became a quiet, sturdy anchor. She'd bring Serafina warm broth, hand-knitted baby booties, and stories of her own resilient life, never prying, always offering a comforting, unspoken solidarity. Serafina even started seeing a local counselor, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a woman with a calm voice and even calmer eyes, trying to untangle the knot of grief and rage that threatened to suffocate her. Trying to find a way to be whole again, not for herself, but for the tiny life that kicked and squirmed within her, a constant, precious reminder of what was at stake. Then, as if summoned by the very darkness of her deepest fears, the real storm hit Port Celeste. It wasn't just wind and rain, it was a biblical deluge, a furious assault of nature that mirrored the impending chaos in Serafina's life. And in the sterile silence of a hospital room, with death itself seeming to knock at the door, the raw, unvarnished truth of their shattered love would be laid bare. Could a new life, conceived in hope but now thrust into a maelstrom of betrayal and fear, possibly bridge the chasm between them? Or was it already irrevocably too late? It began with a sharp, unfamiliar pain, a tightening in her belly that stole her breath, then another and another. Her water broke, not in a gentle trickle, but in a sudden, terrifying gush. Premature birth, the words screamed in her mind. Too soon. Her baby wasn't ready. Mrs. Vance found her doubled over, her face ashen, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The kind old woman, her usual composure momentarily shattered by the urgency of the situation, didn't hesitate. She called the local emergency services, her voice surprisingly firm above the roar of the storm. The ambulance ride to the small, under-equipped Port Celeste Community Hospital was a blur of flashing lights, screaming sirens, and agonizing pain. Each lurch of the vehicle sent fresh waves of agony through Serafina. She was alone, terrified. She clutched her belly, whispering frantic, incoherent pleas to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. "Please, not my baby. Not like this." At the hospital, a harried-looking Dr. Abernathy, his face grim, delivered the devastating diagnosis: severe preeclampsia. Her blood pressure was skyrocketing. It was a life-threatening medical crisis for both mother and child. An emergency C-section was her only chance. Their only chance. The word emergency felt like a cruel understatement. This was a full-blown catastrophe. She was rushed into a small, stark operating room, the frantic beeping of monitors and the urgent, hushed voices of the medical staff, a terrifying symphony of impending doom. More supplies, more doctors, if they could even get them through the storm. She'd never felt so vulnerable, so utterly at the mercy of fate, of strangers. Between waves of pain that threatened to tear her apart, she whispered a name. Not Alistair. Not out of love or longing, but from some primal, animalistic need for something. Comfort? An anchor in the storm? Or maybe just a curse on the man who had brought her to this terrifying precipice. Marcus Thorne, true to his complex nature, hadn't just disappeared after their conversation. He'd stayed in the shadows of Port Celeste, a silent, unseen observer, his promise to Serafina warring with his deeply ingrained sense of responsibility. He developed a grudging respect for her quiet strength, her determination. When word of her medical crisis reached him, small towns have a way of transmitting news faster than any encrypted satellite link, he knew his carefully constructed ethical tightrope was about to snap. This wasn't about Alistair Sterling's possessiveness anymore. This was about life and death. Serafina's life, her baby's life. Her chances in this tiny, storm-battered hospital were slim. Alistair, for all his monumental flaws, had resources. Access to the best medical care money could buy. Could Thorne live with himself if he let Serafina and her child die out of a misplaced loyalty to a promise made under duress? The moral decision when it came was swift, brutal, and absolute. He broke his promise. He had to. He pulled out his satellite phone, the one that always worked, even in the teeth of a hurricane, and dialed the private number for Alistair Sterling. The connection crackled, the storm outside Thorne's own window a pale imitation of the one raging around Serafina. "Sterling," Alistair's voice barked, impatient, already frayed from weeks of fruitless searching and Zara's relentless pressure. "It's Thorne," Marcus said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Serafina's in trouble. Port Celeste Community Hospital. She's critical. Premature labor, complications. They're taking her into surgery now." He didn't add she might die. He didn't need to. The stark facts were damning enough. Alistair Sterling's world, already fractured, imploded. Terror, cold and absolute, seized him. Serafina. Dying? His baby? He was on his private jet before Thorne had even disconnected, barking orders, his usual icy composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. It was a desperate journey. A race against time, the engines of his Gulfstream screaming through the turbulent night sky, each minute an eternity. Had he come too late? Was this his punishment? To lose everything, to be confronted with the ultimate consequence of his deceit in the most brutal way imaginable. The shattering regret was a physical force, crushing the air from his lungs. When Alistair finally stumbled into the chaotic, dimly lit corridors of Port Celeste Community Hospital, his hair disheveled, his eyes hollowed out from the overnight flight and sheer terror, the overworked nurses could hardly believe their eyes. This was Alistair Sterling? The Alistair Sterling, here in their humble, struggling facility? He found Marcus Thorne in the small, grim waiting room, pacing like a caged animal. "She's still in surgery," Thorne informed him, his voice low. "It's bad. The baby, they got the baby out? A boy. He's in what passes for their NICU. Premature, but stable, for now." For a moment, the sheer, unadulterated gravity of fatherhood thundered through Alistair's veins, a terrifying, exhilarating shock. A son. His son. Orion, Serafina had once whispered she'd name their boy after the hunter in the stars. Now, that tiny hunter, their Orion, lay in a makeshift neonatal intensive care unit, fighting for his fragile life. And Serafina, his wife, the woman he had systematically destroyed with his lies, was in critical condition, her life hanging by the slenderest of threads. The regret, oh God, the regret. It was a living thing, coiling in his gut, stealing his breath, heavier than any burden he had ever borne. He pressed his palms to his face, hot, ragged tears escaping from beneath his eyelids. Tears. When was the last time Alistair Sterling had cried? He couldn't remember. Hours later, or was it days? Time had lost all meaning. A weary, white-coated doctor finally emerged from the operating room. He looked exhausted, but there was a flicker of something, not quite hope, but perhaps the absence of despair. "Mr. Sterling?" The doctor's voice was gentle but firm. "Your wife, Serafina, she's in recovery. We managed to control the bleeding. Her blood pressure is still dangerously high, but we're cautiously optimistic. She's not out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, but she's stable. For now." Relief, so potent it buckled his knees, flooded Alistair, though the serpent of guilt still coiled, tight and poisonous in his heart. He nodded, fresh tears blurring his vision. He couldn't speak. What was there to say? The doctor offered a hesitant, exhausted smile. "She'll likely be unconscious for some time. Would you like to see your son? In the NICU?" Shaking with a volatile cocktail of adrenaline, fear, and a bewildering, nascent love, Alistair followed the doctor down a short, sterile corridor. Through the glass panel of a small, isolated room, he saw it. A tiny, transparent incubator, and within it an impossibly small, fragile form. Orion. His son. A baby swaddled in tubes and wires, a tiny warrior fighting a valiant battle for life. A nurse, her face etched with a mixture of weariness and compassion, guided him to scrub his hands, don a gown, and approach the incubator with a reverence he hadn't known he possessed. The moment Alistair Sterling laid eyes on his son, everything else. The scandals, Zara, the billions, the empire he had so ruthlessly built, dissolved into meaningless dust. Nothing mattered but that fragile, flickering life. A wisp of dark hair, impossibly tiny curled fists, eyelids fluttering like moth wings. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the sterile plastic of the incubator. Tears, hot and unrestrained, dripped onto the polished linoleum floor. You're so beautiful," he whispered, his voice a hoarse, broken thing. He didn't even know if Orion was a beautiful baby. All he knew was that this tiny creature was his. His son. A son Serafina had carried, protected, and nearly died for. He prayed, with a desperation that clawed at his soul, for the chance to tell her, to hold their child with her by his side, to somehow, someway, begin to atone for the devastation he had wrought. After a few precious, heart-stopping minutes, the nurse gently suggested he let the baby rest. Alistair nodded, his heart throbbing with a pain and a love so fierce it was almost unbearable. Next, the recovery ward. The corridor was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of unseen machinery and the distant, mournful wail of the storm still raging outside. A sympathetic nurse, her eyes conveying a world of unspoken understanding, pointed him towards Serafina's room. He stepped inside, and his world froze. She lay on the narrow hospital bed, pale as death, still as a marble effigy. Tubes snaked from her arms, an oxygen mask obscuring her beautiful, beloved face. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only reassurance that she was still, somehow, alive. Alistair felt an avalanche of regret, so profound, so absolute, it threatened to bury him. This was the vibrant woman who used to dance with him at glittering galas, whose laughter could fill the vast emptiness of Ethelgard, whose eyes held a universe of intelligence and passion. Now she looked so fragile, so broken. And it was his doing. All his. Slowly, tentatively, he approached her bedside. He knelt, his expensive, custom-made suit creasing unheeded on the cold, sterile floor, and he took her hand, her limp, unresponsive hand, in his. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking, shattering into a million pieces. "Oh God, Serafina, I'm so sorry. Please, please come back to me. Please, if not for me, then for him, for Orion, for our son." He didn't know how long he stayed there, kneeling by her side, his voice a broken litany of apologies and pleas, tears choking every other sentence. Nurses came and went, checking her vitals, offering him polite, pitying smiles, perhaps all too aware of the raw, agonizing heartbreak that saturated the very air in that small, sterile room. 2 days later, days that felt like 2 agonizing centuries, Serafina's eyelids fluttered, opened. She was alive. Her son was alive. But the man who had shattered her world, the architect of her deepest pain, was now the first face she saw as she clawed her way back from the precipice of death. Could forgiveness ever bloom in a field so ravaged by betrayal, or was his very presence just another, more refined, form of torment? The battle for her life had been won by the barest of margins. But the war for her heart, for their future, for any semblance of peace or healing, that, Alistair knew with a chilling, soul-deep certainty, had only just begun. The war for Serafina's heart, as Alistair Sterling knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, was a battleground littered with the explosive remnants of his own treachery. And as Serafina's eyes fluttered open in that stark, sterile room in the Port Celeste Community Hospital, the first volley was an icy wave of recognition, quickly followed by a surge of raw, unadulterated fury that momentarily eclipsed even the throbbing pain of her ravaged body. Him, it was him. The architect of her ruin, the ghost at her personal feast of suffering, now materialized at her bedside, looking haggard, tear-stained even, pathetic. Did he expect gratitude? Forgiveness? For what? For nearly killing her? They shared a child, a hospital room, and a universe of unspoken pain. Could 2 broken souls, shattered by the same cataclysmic event, one the perpetrator, the other the victim, ever find their way back to each other? Or were some wounds simply too deep, too fundamentally altering to ever truly heal? The air crackled with the question. "Water." Serafina rasped, her throat raw, her voice a barely audible croak. A nurse, bless her efficient soul, hurried over, adjusting the IV drip, offering a small cup with a straw. Alistair flinched as if struck when Serafina's gaze, cold and sharp as obsidian, finally landed on him, truly seeing him. Your baby is fine, Serafina," Alistair said, his voice thick, unsteady. He sounded like a stranger. "Our son. Orion, he's in the NICU, small, but they say he's strong, a fighter. A flicker of something primal, a fierce maternal love, cut through Seraphina's haze of pain and anger. Orion. Her son. She tried to sit up, a sharp wince contorting her features. Where is he? I need to see him. Soon, Alistair replied, his hands hovering uselessly, wanting to help, to touch, but clearly terrified of her reaction. Once you're more stable. The doctors. She cut him off, her voice gaining a sliver of its former strength, laced with pure venom. What are you doing here, Alistair? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. He lowered his head, the picture of contrition. Or was it just another performance? With Alistair, how could she ever know for sure? I had to come, Seraphina. When Marcus Thorne called, when I heard I couldn't let anything happen to you, to him, to Orion, I know you told me not to look for you, but... He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the worn linoleum floor. I am so profoundly sorry, Seraphina, for everything. Her body trembled, a combination of post-operative shock and the fresh onslaught of grief his presence unleashed. Sorry? She whispered, tears finally, betrayingly, forming in her eyes. You have no right to be here, no right to say his name. I told you to leave me alone. He nodded, his own eyes glinting with unshed tears. The great Alistair Sterling, brought low. It should have been satisfying, it wasn't, it was just empty. I know, he said, his voice barely a breath. And I will leave, if that's truly what you want, after you're stronger, after Orion is safe. But please, Seraphina, let me help you through this. Let me be here, for him, if not for me. She was torn. Oh God, how she was torn. A part of her, the raw, bleeding part, despised him with an intensity that shocked her. But another part, the terrified new mother part, the part that had just stared death in the face, was so utterly, bone-deeply weary of fighting alone. Yet how could she simply erase what he'd done? The betrayal wasn't just a crack in their foundation. It was a sinkhole that had swallowed their entire world. They spoke little more that day or the next. The doctors, bless their professional detachment, focused on Seraphina's precarious recovery, on stabilizing her blood pressure, on managing her pain. Alistair, to her silent astonishment, didn't leave. He slept in a hard, uncomfortable visitor's chair outside her room, a rumpled, unshaven sentinel. He spoke only when spoken to, his voice quiet, his usual arrogance seemingly gone. Replaced by what? Guilt? Remorse? Or just a new, more subtle form of manipulation? She couldn't tell, and honestly she didn't have the strength to care. Over the next week, as Seraphina slowly, painstakingly, began to regain some semblance of her physical strength, a fragile, unspoken truce settled between them. It had to. Orion needed them, both of them. When she was finally strong enough to be wheeled to the makeshift NICU, the sight of her son, her tiny perfect Orion, nestled amidst a daunting array of tubes and monitors, shattered what little composure she had left. Tears streamed down her face. Tears of overwhelming love, of profound relief, of gut-wrenching fear. She reached a trembling hand into the incubator, her fingers gently stroking his impossibly small hand, marveling at the miniature perfection of his fingernails. Alistair stood beside her, silent, almost reverent, his presence a strange mixture of comfort and torment. When Orion's tiny fingers instinctively curled around hers, a sob escaped Seraphina. A sound so raw, so full of maternal love, it seemed to shake the very foundations of the sterile room. In that moment, a tiny, almost imperceptible bridge seemed to form over the chasm of their shared pain. A bridge built of shared awe and terror for this new life they had created. If you've ever felt that kind of love, that fierce, all-consuming devotion to a child, then you know what I mean. It changes everything, doesn't it? The days that followed were a blur of neonatal classes, hushed consultations with Dr. Abernathy, and hours spent beside Orion's incubator. They learned to change diapers so small they looked like doll's clothes, to navigate the intimidating array of monitors, to hold their son skin to skin, a practice called kangaroo care that was supposed to help him thrive. In those moments, with Orion's fragile warmth against their chests, their bitter hostility would momentarily pause, replaced by a mutual, desperate devotion to this tiny human being who held both their hearts in his impossibly small fist. Seraphina watched Alistair, really watched him. She saw the uncharacteristic tenderness in his touch, the raw vulnerability in his eyes as he whispered lullabies to their son, the way his usually commanding voice would tremble with unshed tears. This Alistair, this hesitant, heartbroken father, was a stranger to her. And yet, he was undeniably Orion's father. The child sparked something in both of them, a reminder of the love they had once shared, or at least the love she thought they had shared. But even in the midst of this fragile truce, the shadow of Zara Dubois and the other child Alistair had fathered loomed large and unspoken. Could she ever truly forget that? Could any woman? One quiet afternoon, as Orion slept peacefully in his incubator, Serafina finally summoned the courage to ask the question that had been poisoning her thoughts. "What about her?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral, her gaze fixed on her son. "What about Zara's baby?" Alistair flinched, the color draining from his face. He swallowed hard. I'm supporting her financially, Serafina. Of course, the child is innocent in all this." He paused, his voice thick with a shame that felt, for once, genuine. "But I'm not with her, not in any other way. She's about 7 months pregnant now. I realize I have responsibilities there, a lifetime of them, but I am not living with her. I don't want a relationship with her. My only concern right now is you and Orion." Serafina closed her eyes, a long, shuddering breath escaping her lips. "This is so complicated," she murmured, "so messy, so impossibly, heartbreakingly messy." He nodded, his shame a palpable thing in the small, sterile room. "I know. God, Serafina, I know. I wish I could change what I did. I wish I could go back. But I can't." He met her gaze then, his eyes raw with a pain that mirrored her own. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I promise you, I will be here. For you. For him. For as long as you'll let me. If you'll let me." A husband's atonement. Were those just words? Or was this the beginning of something real? A few days later, a small miracle. Orion was cleared to move into a less critical section of the NICU. Each tiny milestone, a stable heart rate, a good feeding, a gram gained, felt like a monumental victory, a cause for quiet, tearful celebration. Despite the complexities, despite the raw, open wound of his betrayal, Serafina found herself leaning, however grudgingly, on Alistair's presence. She needed help. Physical help, yes, as her body slowly recovered from the trauma of the emergency C-section. But also, dare she admit it, emotional support. The tension between them still lingered, a raw, throbbing ache. But necessity, and their shared love for Orion, forced them into an uneasy, day-by-day co-parenting rhythm. It was a fragile truce built on sleepless nights and whispered anxieties. 2 weeks after Orion's tumultuous arrival, Serafina was discharged. Orion, however, still needed to remain in the hospital for a while longer. The thought of returning to the isolated, wind-swept cottage in Port Celeste, with its steep, treacherous steps and its memories of solitary fear, filled her with a fresh wave of dread. How could she manage alone, with a recovering body and a fragile preemie who would soon need round-the-clock care? Alistair, ever the pragmatist, offered a solution. A service department he'd found in a quiet complex near the hospital, complete with on-call nursing support if needed. She hesitated. Accepting his offer felt like another concession, another step back into his orbit, an acknowledgement of him as part of her support system. But what alternative did she have? Her mother, Leonora, was frail. Vivian was overseas. She was, for all intents and purposes, still alone. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart and a head full of conflicting emotions, she agreed. And so began a period of tentative, almost surreal, coexistence. They spent hours each day in the NICU, learning everything they could about caring for a premature infant, preparing for Orion's eventual homecoming. Serafina, physically and emotionally drained, sometimes felt her carefully constructed composure slip. In those moments of overwhelming fear or exhaustion, Alistair would quietly, unobtrusively be there, a steadying hand on her arm, a shared cup of lukewarm coffee, a tissue passed without a word. He never pushed, never presumed. He just was. Nights were a different story. She insisted on her own bedroom, a clearly defined boundary. He stayed in an adjoining suite, a silent, watchful presence. They were partners in parenthood, nothing more, or so she told herself. Yet beneath the surface of their carefully polite interactions, unspoken feelings, complex emotions, simmered like a dormant volcano. Healing, she was discovering, was not a linear process. It was messy, contradictory, and utterly exhausting. One evening, Serafina awoke from a vivid, terrifying nightmare, reliving the horrors of the emergency C-section, the feeling of her life slipping away. She couldn't breathe. her heart hammering against her ribs, convinced she was dying. She stumbled out of her room, gasping for air, and found Alistair in the small common area of their temporary apartment, hunched over his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion etched on his face. He sprang to his feet the moment he saw her, his eyes instantly alert, concerned. Without a word, he guided her to the sofa, handed her a glass of water, and placed a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. And in that moment, something within Serafina, some tightly coiled spring of resistance, finally snapped. She didn't recoil. She didn't push him away. She clung to him, sobbing, the fear of nearly dying, of leaving her baby motherless, overwhelming her in a raw, shuddering wave. He held her, stroking her hair, whispering apologies, over and over and over, for everything. For the pain, the betrayal, the fear, for breaking her, for breaking them. By the time her tears subsided, an exhausted calm had settled over her. Their eyes met, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of some old, forgotten feeling passed between them. A shared trauma, a shared child, a shared something. But the next morning, with the cold light of day, Serafina reminded herself fiercely that healing was not the same as forgetting. And forgiveness? That was a country she wasn't sure she ever wanted to visit again. Not yet, maybe not ever. Then came the call. Just as a fragile semblance of routine, of predictability, had begun to settle over their strange new life, the outside world in the form of Zara Dubois intruded once more. Zara, it turned out, had given birth to a daughter, Lyra, prematurely, just like Orion, and with similar life-threatening complications. Despite their frayed, toxic relationship, despite everything, Zara had reached out to Alistair. Desperate. Her baby, his other child, needed specialized medical care that her local hospital in Port City couldn't provide. Serafina felt a familiar, sickening wave of jealousy, of rage at the mere mention of Zara's name. But beneath the anger, there was something else. A grudging understanding. An innocent child was in trouble. She saw the anguish, the sheer, unadulterated torment on Alistair's face. He was trapped, torn between two impossibly difficult, emotionally devastating responsibilities. She knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that ignoring Zara's plea, forcing him to choose, would condemn him, and perhaps, by extension them, to a lifetime of corrosive guilt. What would you do in that situation? Could you really put your own pain aside for the sake of an innocent child, even if that child was a constant reminder of your husband's betrayal? It's a hell of a question, isn't it? Ultimately, Serafina did something that shocked Alistair to his core. She looked at him, her eyes clear, her voice steady, and said, "Go to her, Alistair. Go make sure your daughter gets the care she needs." Was it forgiveness? No. Not even close. Was it empathy? Perhaps a sliver? Or maybe, just maybe, it was a recognition that their lives were now inextricably, tragically intertwined, bound together by two innocent children caught in the crossfire of their parents' mistakes. With a gratitude that left him speechless, Alistair left for Port City. He arranged for top-tier medical transport for Zara's newborn Lyra. He stayed just long enough to ensure her condition stabilized under the care of pediatric specialists. And then, true to his word, determined to prove his sincerity, his commitment to Serafina and Orion, he returned to Port Celeste within a week. During his absence, Serafina found herself missing him, missing his quiet presence, his steady support, his surprisingly gentle way with Orion. It was a confusing, unwelcome realization. She caught glimpses of her reflection, a tired, recovering mother holding her precious, fragile son, and remembered the nights when Alistair had stood behind her, his hands guiding hers as they learned to navigate the complexities of caring for a preemie. She realized, with a jolt, that even if their marriage never fully healed, even if trust was a bridge too far, she cherished having a partner, a co-parent, to share the crushing burden and the fleeting joys of these early, terrifying days. When Alistair returned, looking even more exhausted, more haunted than before, they had a long, quiet talk. "Lyra is stable," he informed her, his voice heavy. Zara is Zara. I'll be traveling to Port City periodically, of course, to see her. Lyra, I owe her that much. She's my daughter." Serafina nodded, her gaze drifting to Orion, dozing peacefully in his bassinet. "I can't begrudge you that, Alistair," she said softly. And she meant it, mostly. The days that followed were filled with a subdued kind of acceptance. a fragile truce born of shared responsibility and a dawning, reluctant respect. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that their future was going to be messy, complicated, painful. But they also recognized that they were bound together, not just by the wreckage of their past, but by an undeniable, all-consuming love for their son. A love that, slowly, tentatively, began to overshadow the sharpest edges of their heartbreak. Alistair, to his credit, seemed to be undergoing a profound internal shift. He'd taken an indefinite leave of absence from Sterling Global, a move that had sent shockwaves through the financial world. The relentless pursuit of power and profit that had once defined him seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a quiet focus on Orion's health, on Serafina's recovery, and, to her surprise, on attending grueling, emotionally raw therapy sessions with Dr. Evelyn Reed, who had agreed to see them both individually and, eventually, together. It was in one of those early, agonizing joint therapy sessions that Serafina finally let go of some of her bottled-up rage. With trembling words, tears streaming down her face, she recounted every agonizing detail of her heartbreak, her humiliation, her fear. Alistair listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make excuses. He simply listened, his own face a mask of raw, unshielded pain, acknowledging each accusation with a quiet, devastating honesty. He spoke of his own monumental insecurities, his crippling fear of not being enough, of how he'd sought validation, however twisted, in the worst possible ways. It wasn't a justification, not even close, but for the first time Serafina began to see the flawed, broken human being behind the monstrous betrayal. It didn't excuse anything, but it complicated things. "I'm not sure I'll ever trust you again, Alistair," she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "At least not the way I used to. That Serafina is gone." Alistair swallowed hard, his own eyes bright with a pain that mirrored hers. "I accept that," he whispered. "I know I have to earn back any measure of your trust, any measure of your respect. If it takes a lifetime, Serafina, so be it. I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you tell me to." She saw the change in him, the desperate sincerity that seemed for once unfeigned. But was it enough? Could a future, any kind of future, truly be built on the ashes of such a profound, soul-shattering betrayal? She took a shaky breath, a tentative step onto a path that was shrouded in mist and uncertainty. What would this new, terrifying, and strangely hopeful chapter hold for them, for their son, for the tattered remnants of their fractured family? And what about you? If you were in Serafina's shoes, faced with a husband so utterly broken and seemingly repentant, yet responsible for so much pain, could you ever find it in your heart to even consider giving him a second chance? Think about it. Seriously. The answer might surprise you. That leap of faith Serafina Sterling took. It wasn't into sunshine and rainbows. Oh no. It was a plunge into a murky, unpredictable abyss, with no guarantee of a soft landing. But what was the alternative? To remain suspended in the bitter paralysis of her pain, forever defined by Alistair's betrayal? To deny Orion a chance, however slim, at a family, however fractured? So she took that breath. She took that terrifying, uncertain step. And what unfolded wasn't a fairy tale magically restored, because fairy tales shatter, but what rises from those glittering, jagged shards can be something far more real, far more resilient. This wasn't the end of their story, not by a long shot. It was the brutal, messy, and unexpectedly tender beginning of a love they never knew was possible, a love forged in the very fires that had almost consumed them. The year that followed Orion's dramatic entry into the world was a slog. Let's be honest. There's no pretty way to dress up the painstaking, often excruciating process of rebuilding a marriage from a pile of smoking rubble. It was a daily exercise in navigating a minefield of triggers, of unspoken resentments, of fragile, newly laid trust that could be shattered by a careless word, a fleeting shadow of doubt. Co-parenting Orion became their immediate, undeniable focus. This tiny, demanding human was their shared mission, their fragile common ground. Alistair, to his credit, continued to astound her. The relentless, power-hungry tycoon who had once orchestrated global takeovers with chilling precision now approached changing a diaper or soothing a colicky baby with a humbling mixture of terror and fierce, awkward tenderness. He was present, not just physically, but emotionally. He attended every one of Orion's doctor's appointments, learned the intricate dance of preemie care, and sat through endless hours of therapy sessions with Dr. Evelyn Reed. Sessions where Serafina often unleashed the full, unvarnished fury of her pain, and where Alistair, for the first time in his gilded life, simply listened. He absorbed it. He owned it. His husband's atonement wasn't a grand gesture. It was in the quiet consistency of his changed behavior, the slow, steady drip of genuine remorse. And Serafina? She was undergoing her own profound transformation. The trauma hadn't broken her, it had reforged her. The soft, accommodating woman who had once felt like a decorative accessory in Alistair's world was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone with a core of tempered steel, someone who knew her own worth. Finally, she found her resilience in the fierce, unwavering love for Orion, and, surprisingly, in rediscovering her own passions. She reconnected with her family's art curation dynasty, not as a dilettante, but as a sharp, insightful professional with a renewed sense of purpose. Her independence became non-negotiable, a vital part of her healing process. She needed to be Serafina Sterling, not just Alistair's wife, not just Orion's mother, but her own damn self. Then there was the matter of Lyra, Alistair's daughter with Zara Dubois. How do you even begin to navigate that? It was a constant, throbbing reminder of the shattering betrayal. Yet Alistair handled it with a newfound, almost painful transparency. He made regular, discreet trips to Port City to fulfill his financial and paternal responsibilities to Lyra. He never hid these visits from Serafina. He spoke of his daughter with a quiet sadness, a deep sense of obligation, but always with an unwavering reassurance that his commitment, his future, lay with Serafina and Orion. It wasn't easy. God, it wasn't easy. There were nights Serafina lay awake, jealousy and resentment, a bitter taste in her mouth. But she also saw the integrity in his actions, the painful honesty. This was part of their new reality, part of the complex, messy tapestry of their family healing. There were no easy answers, only difficult choices, made day by day. One of the biggest symbols of their old life, the opulent, echoing mausoleum that was Ethelgard, had to go. It was steeped in too many lies, too many ghosts. Selling it was like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin. In its place, they found something smaller. Ueme, a rambling, sun-filled house nestled in a quieter, less ostentatious corner of Starhaven, a place with a sprawling garden for Orion to play in, a cozy kitchen that smelled of baking bread instead of caterers' canapés. They chose it together. They decorated it together. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to build not just a new home, but a new kind of home, one founded not on illusion, but on the hard-won truths of their shared experience. What was the secret to their evolving, fragile truce, this improbable journey towards something resembling a rebuilt marriage? It wasn't about forgetting the past. How could they? The scars remained, pale and livid, a permanent reminder of the devastation. No, the emotional honesty they were forced to confront meant acknowledging that the betrayal was now woven into the very fabric of their story. It was about integrating it, learning from it, and vowing, every single damn day, to do better. To be better. Theirs was no longer the naive, untested love of a fairy tale. This was something else, something tougher, something forged in fire, tempered by pain, and ultimately, surprisingly, unbreakable. A transformed love. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. There were still arguments, still moments of doubt, still nights when Serafina retreated into the solitude of her own thoughts, the shadows of the past looming large. But there were also shared victories. Orion's first infectious giggle, his wobbly first steps, his messy first birthday cake. Moments of unexpected grace, of shared laughter, of a quiet, comfortable companionship that felt more real, more precious than all the glittering illusions of their former life. They learned to communicate, truly communicate for the first time. They learned the language of forgiveness, not a one-time event, but a daily practice, a conscious choice. Second chances, they discovered, weren't about erasing the past, but about having the courage to write a new future, together, despite it. So what's the takeaway from a story like Serafina and Alistair's? That love conquers all? That every betrayal deserves forgiveness? Hell no, it's not that simple. And anyone who tells you it is selling you a fantasy. Their journey, steeped in pain and illuminated by a fragile, hard-won hope, reminds us that even the most devastating heartbreaks can be met with an unwavering strength, a fierce resilience we often don't know we possess until we're tested. Serafina, by forging her own path, by demanding honesty and change, discovered that love, true love, doesn't have to vanish in the face of betrayal. It can transform. It can evolve into something deeper, something more honest, something, dare I say, even stronger, though infinitely more complicated. And Alistair? He learned the hard way that wealth and power mean absolutely nothing without respect, loyalty, and the courage to confront your own demons. He spent his days striving, truly striving, to become a man worthy of the second chance he'd been so miraculously and perhaps undeservedly given. Their story isn't a neat happily ever after. It's a testament to the messy, complicated, and often heartbreaking reality of human relationships. It's a story of hope after heartbreak, of the grueling, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust, piece by fragile piece. It shows us that sometimes, just sometimes, the hardest fights, the ones that strip us bare and force us to confront our deepest fears and failings, can yield the greatest, most unexpected rewards. If we dare to believe in redemption, if we dare to believe in the enduring strength of the human heart to heal, to grow, to love again, even beyond the scars. So let me ask you this. What are the gilded cages in your own life? What are the shattered illusions you're still sweeping up? And where, in the midst of your own messy, imperfect story, can you find the courage to forgive, to rebuild, to believe in the possibility of a love reimagined? Because if Serafina and Alistair's journey teaches us anything, it's that even in the deepest darkness, there's always a flicker of hope, always a chance for a new beginning. If you're brave enough to reach for it, what will you reach for today?